Hey guys, Will here. Welcome back to our conclusion of the Fanatec DD2 review series. So, over the last few days, we've taken a look at the hardware, the software, and the Fanatec ecosystem in detail. And we discussed and compared some of the hardware elements of the Fanatec Direct Drive wheelbases with their Simucube counterparts and looked at their vitally important role that drivers and software play as well. So now it's time to tie everything together and take a look at the overall driving experience with the Fanatec DD2. So as I mentioned in the previous videos, I had originally intended for this to be a raw first drive style video. And yeah, things didn't exactly go to plan. That's what I'd done with the Simucube 2 Ultimate videos previously, but I quickly realized that this wasn't going to work for two different reasons. The first being that because I'd already experienced the best of the best, there was no way that my reaction to the DD2 was going to be as extreme as it had been with the Simucube 2 Ultimate. Now, the second reason was that, to be honest with you guys, my first experience with the DD2 wasn't actually all that impressive. And I sort of talked about that a little bit yesterday. I started off by installing the official release version 335 drivers from the Fanatec website, along with loading Fanatec's recommended game driver settings as a base point. And although being a lot stronger, I didn't really feel that there was any extra, I guess, fidelity over what I was used to from the Club Sport Wheelbase 2.5. So, having studied all of the other reviews on YouTube and doing a ton of reading, I realized that obviously something must be going wrong here and that my experience certainly wasn't the same as what was being conveyed by other users. So I set about experimenting with some of the newer beta drivers, and as I explained in yesterday's video, I was immediately blown away by the difference that those newer drivers made. So this was now the experience that I had expected from the DD2 out of the box. So what I'm going to do in today's video is take you through each of the sim titles that I tested, including iRacing, Assetto Corsa Competizione as well, Project Cars 2, Dirt Rally 2, F1 2019 and Raceroom, and not only share my overall impressions, but also compare those impressions from my own point of view, having 3 months worth of experience now with the same titles using my Simucube 2 Ultimate. So I'll take you through the nuances of each title and highlight some of the common traits and nuances between them, and then wrap it all up with my conclusions on whether or not I think the Fanatec DD2 is a worthy contender for your sim rig. So before we go any further, I just want to quickly highlight that this is purely my own opinion based on my own experience over the course of the past week of testing. Now, everybody has their own preferences when it comes to feel and features, and therefore, you know, I'll do my best to highlight these in an attempt to give you all the information that you need to make your own decision based on what's important to you guys. So with all of that out of the way, let's get started with iRacing. So with the latest drivers, including the new interpolation filter that we talked about in yesterday's software video, as well as the recommended settings loaded for both the drivers and the game, I was ready for my first proper experience with the DD2. So as iRacing is the sim that I've spent the most time with recently, and therefore the one I'm most familiar with, I decided to jump straight in the deep end and race with the Porsche 911 GT3 against AI from the rear of the grid. What I wanted to try and do here is load my sensors up to the max to see how natural the wheel felt and how quickly I was able to adapt from the familiar Simucube 2 Ultimate. So as I launched the car and negotiated the traffic into turn 1, I was immediately impressed with the level of fidelity, the smoothness, the weight and responsiveness that I felt through the steering. The understeer was communicated accurately, and I immediately felt like it was natural to me. The issues that I'd experienced with the notchy and robotic feeling previously with the older drivers and firmware was just about entirely gone. And instead of the wheelbase feeling, I guess, marginally better than what I was used to with the Club Sport Wheelbase 2.5, it now felt a lot better. And honestly, within a lap or two, I'd completely forgotten that I wasn't using my familiar Simucube 2 Ultimate. So it was only when I switched back to the Simucube 2 Ultimate again that I noticed a few subtle improvements. There was mostly sort of in the finer detail like road texture and the general feeling of weight in the steering rack. As I highlighted in my review of the Simucube 2 Ultimate a few months back now, you genuinely are transported into the cabin of a car when you drive with that wheelbase. You feel all the little details like the weight of the car and the steering rack just like you do in a real car. And with the settings dialed in, there really isn't a hint of latency or notchiness or any of that robotic feeling that will be familiar to a lot of sim racers. But back again to the DD2 to fiddle around with some of the settings and to see what I could really get out of it, having sort of familiarized myself with the baseline. And while I wasn't able to detect any additional latency in the DD2, the ever so slight lack of resolution in the rotational axis was noticeable compared with the Simucube 2 Ultimate. And I'll do my best to get my hands on a Pro and a Sport to verify this remains on the more comparably priced units into the future. But to be fair, when actually driving, particularly at speed, the difference is barely detectable. But sitting in a stationary car and turning the wheels with the Simucube 2 Ultimate, you genuinely feel the resistance of the tyres interfacing with the surface of the track as you do in real life. And while you do still feel this resistance with the DD2, the level of detail just isn't quite there. And while the difference may be very small, it does lend itself to a slightly less immersive and believable experience behind the wheel. But overall, I was very impressed with the driving experience in iRacing after updating to the latest drivers and firmware. Now, as iRacing's force feedback does operate at a relatively low 60 Hz, the interpolation filter is obviously playing a very significant role in reducing the robotic feeling that's inherent when you transmit data from a sim directly to your hands through a direct drive wheelbase. We talked about that in the software video yesterday. So I've got to say that Fanatec have done an excellent job with their implementation for iRacing. So on to Assetto Corsa next. Now, this is a title that I'm a lot less familiar with. Those of you who watch my channel regularly would know most of my content these days revolves around iRacing. That is something that I'm looking at fixing very soon for you guys. But one of the biggest reasons for that is that since changing to the Simucube 2 Ultimate, I've always found quite a large difference in the feeling of force feedback between the various different sim titles. And even though I've spent quite a bit of time tweaking all the settings to try and match it as closely as I can, the lack of overall consistency between the titles has made it difficult for me to jump between titles and produce content without a steep learning curve each time. Now, we all know that the comments section on YouTube can be pretty brutal if your driving isn't up to the generally accepted standard. So it's something that I've sort of historically avoided with the channel. So once again, having loaded the recommended driver and game settings from Fanatec, like I showed you guys yesterday, my first impression was one of surprise, as the feeling I got through the wheel was a lot more consistent with what I just experienced in iRacing than I had expected. In fact, the only real difference that I noticed was a slightly more defined sensation of understeer and slightly more detailed textures when I ran off the track and over a ripple strip. So I tried a few different cars, and while the steering generally felt a little bit lighter than it did in iRacing, this was easily accounted for in the game settings, and I found myself able to adapt to the game relatively quickly, although I'm sure you guys that are watching this footage are probably cringing. So while the detail still wasn't quite as good as I was used to with the Simucube 2 Ultimate, I really appreciated the consistency, and that really got me thinking that I need to go back and spend more time adjusting my Simucube 2 Ultimate to really get the feeling more consistent there as well across titles. So next I moved across to Assetto Corsa Competizione, and again, I was impressed with the consistency and the feel here. So this is a title that I've not spent a lot of time with playing at all due to the previous issues with VR and triple screen support, but I found myself instantly immersed and having a good time. Notably, the details like road textures and ripple strips felt a lot better here. This was probably the best title that I tested out of all of them in terms of that sort of overall feel of textures and things like that. But it really made me feel like I need to put a lot more time into the title in the future, because it really has come a long way since this game was first launched. So next on the agenda was Dirt Rally 2. And again, a game that I haven't spent a lot of time with due to the lack of decent triple screen support. So here the road texture was definitely lacking compared to the titles that I tested previously, but this was also the case with the Simucube 2 Ultimate as well, and I believe this is purely down to the way the game communicates the force feedback data back to the drivers. So honestly, I could feel very little difference here between the DD2 and the SC2 Ultimate, and yeah, really the only differences were those subtle nuances and characteristics of the wheelbases that we already discussed in the video. So again, I was impressed with the consistency in how the steering forces such as the tyre slip and understeer were communicated through the wheel. And while I was embarrassingly slow simply due to the lack of experience with this title, I was still able to have a good time with the game. So next I tested out Project Cars 2, and things were a little bit different here. Again, I followed Fanatec's recommended settings, including loading Jack Spade's force feedback files. And now I have to admit that I've never been particularly impressed with how the force feedback's conveyed in this title, regardless of the wheelbase that I'm using. I've tried it with the G920, I've tried it with the Simucube, a whole bunch of different wheelbases, CSL Elite as well. And to me, the cars all feel quite boat-like. There's a general lack of detail in the road textures. You know, effects like understeer are too pronounced, and it leads to the overall feeling of disconnection between the car and the road surface. I've often joked that the force feedback in this game feels a lot like I'd imagine it would feel in the old PlayStation title Wipeout, where you were flying around in a spaceship and you weren't even touching the road. But I gotta say, in this title, the DD2 felt noticeably more robotic. Now, I believe that this is down to the need to put the DD2 into the Club Sport Wheelbase 2.5 compatibility mode to work with this title. I assume that this is resulting in a lower resolution processing, which would account for probably the differences that I felt. Although overall, the Simucube 2 Ultimate feels a lot nicer to me than the DD2 did. I do think that this can be improved in the future with updated game wheelbase support though. So next up was F1 2019. Now this is a title that I've spent far more hours playing than I would care to admit. But admittedly, I've been taking a bit of a break from this one lately as I've been focusing on iRacing. But again, with Fanatec's recommended driver and game settings, the game felt great straight out of the box. And yeah, I felt very little need to actually change anything at all. The only detected differences here between the Simucube 2 Ultimate and the DD2 were again down to those little subtle characteristics of each wheelbase. And while the Simucube 2 feeling is slightly smoother to turn and therefore a little bit more immersive, otherwise the effects like the understeer, the road textures, which admittedly aren't fantastic in this game to begin with, all felt pretty consistent. And again here, I appreciated the consistency between the feel that I had with this game and the previous different titles that I'd tested, with the exception, of course, of Project Cars 2. So one thing that I should also note is that my DD2 and Formula V2 wheel were immediately detected and the appropriate default button maps were loaded without the need for me to configure anything. So I was literally able to just plug the wheelbase in and get going straight away. So now by comparison, the Simucube 2 Ultimate took quite a bit of messing around to get working correctly in F1 2019. So that was just something that I wanted to note there for you guys as well. Now the last title that I tested was Raceroom, and you guys will remember I had all sorts of issues getting Raceroom to feel right with my Simucube 2 Ultimate. I spent many hours trying to remove that dead zone and notchiness that I was feeling through the steering, and I even went as far as spending hours on forums and even talking to some experts as well to really try and nail down those settings, but I was never really able to get it to the point where I was happy with it. And admittedly, I never even managed to get it to feel as good as it had with my Club Sport Wheelbase 2.5 previously. So although I did come back to it and try it again when they released their force feedback update recently, admittedly, ultimately, I pretty much just gave up on the game altogether and I haven't really come back and tried it again since. So naturally, I didn't have higher hopes at all for the DD2 here, but to my absolute shock, after loading Fanatec's recommended driver and game settings once again, it actually felt fantastic. Even more impressive was the fact that it actually felt consistent with the overall driving experience I'd had with iRacing, Assetto Corsa and Competizione as well. So this actually left me really impressed. It might not sound like a big deal, but to me this makes a huge difference because it means that I'm able to jump in and out of various different sim titles without feeling like I have to learn to drive all over again every single time. So this is something that I definitely don't think should be overlooked if you're frequently switching between different sims. All right, so in conclusion, the DD2, when combined with the latest drivers and firmware, and that is extremely important as we've covered multiple times now, it's definitely surpassed my expectations and it's really left me quite impressed. Now, there's no denying that the Simucube 2 Ultimate definitely does have an edge when it comes to those finer details, but neither wheelbase is perfect and both definitely have their strengths and weaknesses. So honestly guys, ultimately the decision comes down to you and what's most important to you in your driving experience. If you want the best of the best, you don't care how much it costs and you're willing to put in the extra time that it takes to really extract every single last little bit of performance out of your wheelbase, then it's a bit of a no-brainer. You just go with the Simucube 2 Ultimate. There's no doubt in my mind that that product represents the best of the best when it comes to direct drive wheelbases, at least at this point in time. But my experience with the Fanatec DD2 over the past week has definitely convinced me that there's still a lot of potential in my Simucube 2 Ultimate. Those areas where the DD2 really shined and was more consistent throughout different sim titles is definitely something that's inspired me to go back and see if I can indeed achieve the same thing with my Simucube 2. But having said that, the fact that this just sort of worked straight out of the box was definitely an advantage in those sim titles where that was a factor. But there's also a lot to be said for Fanatec's ecosystem. As we touched on in our previous videos, Fanatec have done an awesome job of building a collection of easy to use and cross-compatible hardware that just works. And while a lot of the features that they do offer can be replicated for the most part using other third-party products and software, things like SimHub, you know, it's just so much more convenient with Fanatec. You just plug it in, everything just works as long as you've got the right drivers and firmware. And I think that Fanatec's ability to make the fine-tuning adjustments to the force feedback characteristics on the fly directly from the wheel definitely represents a noticeable point of difference and something that shouldn't be underestimated. So one topic that I see come up quite often is people saying that Simucube and the True Drive software is just too difficult to set up, takes too much time to get right, and that Fanatec is just so much easier. And look, I wouldn't say that True Drive is fundamentally more difficult to set up than Fanatec's drivers and Fanalab software. Look, there are even elements of True Drive that are a little bit more intuitive than Fanatec's system, like the ability to install everything with one package as opposed to having to install the drivers and Fanalab separately. But look, the Fanatec ecosystem definitely lends itself to slightly more streamlined workflow, and I think that's mostly down to the integration in the games itself. Obviously, Fanatec's been around for a lot longer, and you know, Simucube's relatively new to the scene, so a lot of those titles, you know, Simucube didn't exist when those titles were made, so therefore, you know, inherently things are a little bit easier with the Fanatec ecosystem. But I definitely think that that gap will close over time, and I don't necessarily see it as being a big factor in the purchasing decision either way. But yeah, I mean, as you've seen in this video, there was definitely more consistency between the different titles with the DD2, and that's definitely something that I think can be addressed in the future through software by Simucube. But look, when it comes to the more raw sim racing titles like iRacing and Assetto Corsa, there's a lot less difference. It's mostly just those titles like the Codemasters titles and stuff like that. And really, I mean, with both devices, all you really have to do is just map your controls and you're good to go in titles like iRacing and Assetto Corsa. Now, Fanatec certainly have some areas of improvement as well, and I would personally love to see more clear communication and transparency around their roadmap for added features, as well as full release drivers. So when you consider just how much better the DD2 feels with the current beta driver compared with the current full release driver that's on their website, at the time of making this video at least, I really do question just how many people simply don't know what they're missing out on because they're running what they think is the latest full release driver. So this is certainly something that, in my opinion, needs to be improved. However, I see no reason why that can't be achieved. I think that Fanalab is very much in its infancy right now, and I'm sure that as time goes on, we'll see better integration there, and hopefully by the end of it, it'll all just be one package that you install together. But one thing that I definitely want to mention here is that both brands certainly seem to be dedicated to the future development of their products, and that's something that I'm really excited about because I think that's really important for the sim racing community in general. Now, on the flip side, I also think that Simucube have some areas where they could definitely learn from Fanatec as well. So for example, their current implementation of that slider to enable the high torque mode is clumsy and annoying, to be frank. And you know, when you compare it with Fanatec's implementation with the physical torque key and just having to turn the wheel to the side or press the funky switch, I definitely think that Fanatec has the edge there. But look, this is really just nitpicking. I think that we're still in the infancy, as I said before, for both brands, and we'll definitely continue to see improvements on both sides, both in terms of the software and the hardware. But as I said before, both brands certainly seem to be dedicated, which is perhaps the most important thing. So one other area that you guys have asked me to touch upon is customer support. So my experience with both brands has been positive, and I've shared in previous videos regarding my customer support experience with Fanatec when I had to send a wheel back due to a snapped pin. But I'm also aware that being a YouTuber in a relatively niche community does lend itself to preferential treatment, and my experience might not necessarily be indicative of the average consumer. So I think it's best to leave this one up to you guys to decide. But look, just keep in mind that generally speaking, people are far more likely to share their negative experiences than their positive ones. So don't let one person's bad experience with either brand put you off. I think anybody who's worked in customer support will probably be able to tell you that they can count on one hand the number of times somebody's rung them up and said, hey, I'm really happy with that thing that I just bought from you guys, but they've probably lost count of the number of complaints that they've had. And I mean, you know, these ratios certainly don't seem to mirror the total sales versus RMA requests and returns. So just keep that in mind when you're talking about customer support. Now, there is one fundamental difference between Fanatec and Simucube that I do just want to highlight here. Now, both brands maintain a very healthy presence online, which is fantastic. And generally speaking, if somebody asks a question, both brands jump on it pretty quickly in the various different Facebook groups. But Fanatec handle just about all of their customer service inquiries themselves, whereas Simucube don't sell directly to the public, at least not yet. So your experience with customer support from Simucube is more likely to depend on the dealer that you purchased it from rather than the brand itself. So I don't really see either approach as a problem, but just definitely something to be aware of. So final thoughts on the Fanatec DD2. Now, what has perhaps surprised me the most about this wheelbase is the fact that I've been using it for a week now, and at no point have I really felt the immediate urge to go back to my Simucube 2 Ultimate, and I really expected that that would be the case. While overall the DD2 doesn't feel quite as refined as the Simucube 2 Ultimate does, both in terms of the quality of the hardware as well as the driving experience, the overall driving experience is actually surprisingly close. I think ultimately it's going to come down to you and where you place your value in the products that you purchase. Throughout this video series, we've highlighted what I feel are the strengths and areas of improvement for both brands. And I'm confident that whichever path you take, you'll be happy with your purchase. So I really do hope that you guys have found this video series helpful and are now feeling in a better position to make your decision. As I've mentioned before, there are links in the description below to where you can purchase these products. And in the case of Fanatec, I do receive a small commission from the sales that are made using those links, which really does help to keep this channel running. So I really do appreciate that, guys. But look, all that's left to say now is thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.